And welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today's episode is a recording of another event in the SNHU History Speaker Series, which brings together professional historians, students, faculty, and staff to talk about research projects, new publications, and history-related careers. At this event, I spoke with Dr. Rob Clemm, who co-edited an award-winning book on military conflicts around the world during the supposedly peaceful interwar period between World Wars I and II. Rob and I discussed the book development process and reminisced about our old grad school days, which may only be interesting to us, but come check it out anyway. Tonight, at this History Speaker Series event, I am very happy to talk to Dr. Rob Clemm. Dr. Clemm is an associate professor of strategy at Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. Prior to his work with the U.S. Air Force, he was an associate professor at Grove City College in western Pennsylvania. His first book is A Violent Peace, A Global History of the Interwar Period from the University Press of Kansas. And he has a forthcoming work called Delineating Dominion on Cartography in Africa, which will be coming out with DeGruyter Press in 2027. So, Rob, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for all of you who've joined. Right now, I feel I should do a rendition of St. Crispin's speech. We few, we happy few, but much obliged. I hope more than anything, you can get some better appreciation and understanding of how history works, the discipline, any number of things. And I hope that can be a benefit to you because, like Dr. Denning, I am first and foremost a teacher, and that's why we're doing things like this to hopefully help you better understand what it is we do and why people still pay us even though Wikipedia exists. That's a bigger question.
Well, if we have some dead air, we'll have you do the St. Crispin speech. But for now, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Tell us about your background beyond what I've just read off here. What have you been up to for your adult life?
Let's see. Let's see. From upstate New York originally, Rochester, um, and went to the University of Rochester for my undergrad. There I began what I would largely say is my circuitous route as an academic. I always took the scenic route, maybe not the best route. I came in, I was ready to be a political scientist, and I took just enough courses to realize, oh no, 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 no. That U of R is great, wonderful positive political theory department, but just one of these things where I started to realize I was not simpatico with that sort of approach. Um, I was doing history as well, and by senior year, I had determined that I didn't want to be a lawyer and I didn't want to be a journalist. Not a great place to be senior year. But somehow my undergraduate advisor, Dr. Celia Applegate, um, saw something I couldn't see, said, "Hey, do you want to be my TA for the freshmen in my Europe after 1945 class?" Okay. So she gave me the freshman. So, because as a senior, I doubt any senior would listen to me, let alone want to be graded by me. But gave me the freshman. And that was it. I fell in love with teaching. I fell in love with the whole process. At that time, I was still foolish enough to think I enjoyed grading, but it was fantastic. It was wonderful. I went, oh, good. I want to do history, um, and then I'll go a little bit down this route. Maybe this might be of benefit to the students. Um, I realized, okay, I want to do history. Now, if any of you ever want to pursue graduate school, there's one very big problem you'll notice with that. Everybody offers history as a graduate degree. So where do you go past, I don't know, throwing a dart at a map? Um, I started to look through all of the work that I had done. A paper on the Japanese Self-Defense Force and how it dealt with the Constitution, a paper on uh, the West German and East German militaries, were they reflective of the post-war societies of each of those states? I was like, huh, I guess I just do a lot of stuff about the military. Uh, Can I look at that? And discovered a bunch of military history programs, started applying to them, um, and then had a very easy decision made for me. After all the applications, two places came back. King's College London said, "We accept you, and here's where you send the check." And The Ohio State University said, "We'll accept you, and we'll give you 5 years of funding." It's not even really, the scales didn't even need to be pulled out, and so went there. And also where I met the esteemed Dr. Denning, and went there, and well, I guess the circuitous route continued. Um, I, I've met my advisor for the very first meeting, and I talked to him about a senior thesis I've been working on interwar German military development and all the rest of the stuff. And he says, he sort of leans back in his chair and he goes, "That's kind of been done."
Fun.
Yeah, sorry, you know, the vision of everything crumbling before your eyes happens. Um, and so I spent about a year and a half exploring a bunch of different classes, different topics. Um, Eventually, sort of stumbled toward, with the advice of several of the faculty, um, exploring looking at Africa and starting to look at the German military there. And then a professor there said, "Have you looked at maps?" Started being curious what he meant by that, and started exploring that and diving into what I later found out was the field of critical cartography, and starting on a project that will become, fingers crossed, this book with de Gruyter. Um, and so, as I told people in terms of planning, recognize that it might go on some circuitous routes because, you know, in terms of my planning, I was looking at Germany in the interwar period, and other than changing centuries, continents, and topics, I was exactly on the right path that I had planned out. Um,
Hmm.
so anyway, all to say, if you're looking at where you want to go, uh, recognize that it's not going to be a straight line. Um, and if I have any other broader advice, I would say, you know, when you're looking at schools, try to think about a larger school with resources and help. Because if I was because sometimes when you're coming out of undergrad, you want that nice little, you know, tight knit group with your, you know, one professor that you want to work with and all this stuff. Well, what if he retires? What if you don't have funding? Um, what if you're like me, you change centuries, you go on your merry way. At Ohio State, I had the opportunity to have the resources there, not only in terms of funding, but also faculty experience to help guide me in a whole new project that ultimately was critical in getting me my first job. Grove City College was looking for a European history professor. Okay, I can do that. But they also wanted, as part of their job ad, they wanted someone who could do a non-Western field. Well, because of that and the fact that I was teaching Africa at that time, I got my first job. And just so you know, the whole I graduate and I go into a job, that usually doesn't happen. And so I was very fortunate in that regard. Very, very lucky. And so it's one of those things where as you explore a topic, you know, just even as your research goes, go where the things are taking you, where they're leading you. You'll get somewhere interesting. Yes, as someone from New York, I didn't expect to end up in Montgomery, Alabama, where um, it's very hot. But you know, it's the route that's taken me, and I've enjoyed the trip.
Yeah, and so the folks that got here late, yeah, we were catching up. Uh, Rob and I were catching up a bit about our Ohio State days. We both started back in 2005 at the same time. We both survived the culling and the attrition that always happens in those
Yeah.
grad school programs, and we both came out of it alive. and with the degree. So I guess we're both
Yeah.
success stories in the annals of
Yep.
the Ohio State University
The Ohio
history.
State University. Yep.
Yes, indeed. Uh, so um, so one of the things that we were going to talk about tonight is your, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, your first book has come out, A Violent Peace: A Global History of the Interwar Period. Can you tell us a bit about this book? How did it come about?
Hmm.
And what was your role in putting it all together?
Well, uh, I guess I'll start with again, sort of a more a philosophical point. Um, when you go into graduate school, if you choose to do it, there often is a push to almost atomize yourself. You be your own little person, do your own research, just focus on that. Don't care about those around you. Just, get your work done, all the rest of the stuff. And that's a load of nonsense. I did not make it through grad school without colleagues and friends who are I'm still friends with to this day. Um, and this book is a product of that because it formed out of a friendship with Dr. Ian Johnson, my co-editor, um, who also was a military history student in the Ohio State University. And so I gotten to know him as a elder graduate student while he was coming up. And so that friendship is what actually sparked this book. Um, Dr. Johnson is a truly how do I put it? Um, it's a wonderful thing that he is such a nice person because otherwise he could be insufferable in terms of just how brilliant he's been, how successful he's been. He's at Notre Dame right now. He's got tenure. He's doing great. Thankfully, he's a fantastic person. But we were at a conference once and we were chatting, and he was mentioning that he had had this idea kicking around for a while of an edited book about the interwar period. And we were chatting about it for probably, I don't know, half an hour over drinks. And the next day I saw him and I said, hey, we talked about that. Why don't we go try and talk to an editor? At academic conferences, they usually have a big room with all of the publishers showcasing books that you can buy, but also editors there who are um, happy to hear pitches for books. Um, and so I would say that Ian provided, I think, very much the catalyst, and then of the idea and all of this stuff. I provided the catalyst of why not? Let's just walk up to somebody and see what they think. Um, I think two publishers showcased a real disinterest, and then we wandered over to the University Press of Kansas's booth, talked with the editor there, Joyce, and she said, "Wow, I'm really intrigued by that. Send me an email." Um, we started communicating, writing up the sort of prospectus for it, our proposal for what the book would be, and sent it off to her, and she said, "Okay, I think this is a good book. I think this is a good idea." And so he had done a lot of the legwork in terms of thinking ahead, in terms of conflicts we wanted to cover, as well as some ideas of who could be contributors or people who might be interested in contributing. Um, because an edited collection, what you have is each chapter is written by a different author. And so looking for people with different specialties and the like. And so that's what kicked it off. At least sort of the genesis of this book. Um, and forgive the voice, Montgomery also now, beyond being hot, has horrible pollen. So,
Oh yeah.
uh, so what is the book? Um, One of the things in terms of historiography, which is the history of history, um, is a is sort of the development of how do we look at the world wars. Um, for many years, it was operational history. That's sort of what are the campaigns? What are the operational aspects of the Battle of Kursk, the Battle of Stalingrad? Um, strategic questions over how, what is leading to the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. And for a long time, there had been national histories. What was the American experience? What was the German? What was the English, French? Um, it had certainly grown since then, though, from the 70s onwards. This was a push towards something called new military history, looking at war and society. How does military affairs interact with government, politics, society? What are the role of minorities within it? All sorts of strands of historical development, history from the bottom up, all the rest. And the genesis of it was looking at the question of why haven't we started to do some of the same developments in the interwar period? And one of the strands of that development in looking at World War I and World War II was a globalized focus. Not just, the war consists of Moscow, London, Washington, and everybody else are just pawns on a board that you move around. But what is the globalized focus? What is the effect of World War II on Africa beyond how it affects Erwin Rommel's tanks or Bernard Montgomery? What is the effect on the populations? What is the globalized? How does that help us better understand the nature of the conflict? And so this had been a push that had occurred in looking at World War I and World War II, and we said, well, why can't we have that globalized look and understanding of this interwar period? Now, another point behind this is when you say the word interwar, what does that mean? Well, of course, it means it's between the wars. So it's a time of peace. But it isn't. During this period of time, so 1919, if you want to put it that way, 1919 through at least 36, if not 39, you are looking at 20 million combatants in conflicts across the globe and over 8 million casualties. This is not a peaceful period at all. In fact, it is an extremely violent period. And so we wanted to say, how can we assess what's going on here? And how can we do that with a more globalized focus? So we sought to bring out a number of conflicts. And so when we approached our authors, we said, we want you to look at your varied conflicts. And these, let me pull up so these included, for example, fighting on the Indo-Afghan frontier, the Rift War in Morocco, the Chaco War in South America. I looked at the RAF in Somaliland. Others looked at the Spanish Civil War, of course. Others at issues in Africa, some in terms of the issues in Manchukuo prior to the Second World War, if you will, breaking out in Asia. So trying to look at all these areas, all these periods, or all these places and say, what can we make sense of this? So we told our authors, look at your conflict, look at the area of your focus, and tell us what connections do you see specifically between World War I and World War II? What connections can you draw to that? Then beyond that, secondly, what, in terms of some themes we gave them, what other connections do you see, whether technology, ideology, things like that? What other connections can you draw? Where do you see any connections? And then the third element we gave them to think about was in the post-war period, Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill both posited a theory that the First and Second World Wars were a new or second 30 Years' War. if you're unfamiliar, the 30 Years' War is a conflict that occurred in Europe in the early 17th century, 1618 through 1648. Um, Chaotic war. Uh, Led to it was a gigantic series of confessional wars that occurred in Europe, in which armies traipsed back and forth, mostly across the German lands from France, Sweden, Poland. You have Austria, England's involved. Just a mess of armies traipsing all across, and devastating conflict, devastating war. Um, but in many ways also a war that prefigured what would come, because it was in many ways the conflict was so brutal and so awful. Uh, you got a shift away from confessional war in Europe. You moved away from religious war to, by the end, wars centered around kingdoms or central states. Um, the peace treaty, for example, that ended it, Peace of Westphalia, is held up as the archetype of the beginnings of modern diplomacy, state-centered diplomacy. Um, the Pope is sort of sent a copy, if you will. He's not involved. So a massive change. Um, and so what both de Gaulle and Churchill said was, is this like that? Is this, and I think what they were getting at, it was more the idea of there was this broader, larger conflict that was going on where amid all of the differences, amid all of the specifics, you saw this theme of what's going on. Probably in Winston Churchill's mind, it's Germans bid for dominance that is crushed. Um, but they posited this idea of the First World War and Second World War connected in such a way that that's really what's going on. And so we asked our authors to say, is there any validity to this? These two famous figures suggested this. In looking at it in a global perspective, what do you see? Is there any value to it? Is there any utility? And so we, suggested, we gave them sort of this construct and said, go forth and write. And when we had all of our authors, they accepted, and they go off and do it.
How do you select the authors?
Well, again, I think that 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 fits with sort of that collegiality and all the rest, that you're not an atomized individual. A lot of it was just people. Dr. Johnson knew a number in terms of different specialty areas and had reached out to them through that. I tried to reach out to others as well. And so oftentimes you're really building it off of that knowledge of either them personally, or I know they've done this type of work, that area of specialty. They'd be good at it. So for example, Dr. Waddell, who did the chapter on the Rift War, I know because he works also at Air University, also as a friend from graduate school. I knew he was able to work on a French topic because he was a student of French military history. His dissertation was on the French in Indochina, and so he was able to pull on that and was able to assist. Dr. Johnson knew a number of them from different conferences he'd been at or interacted with them before, and we didn't have to do sort of a cold call for papers, as sometimes has to do, but we relied on those connections to help us at least ask a number of individuals. I knew from Dr. Tim Stapleton, who's he will forget more about Africa than I will ever know. Um, I knew he had kindly commented on a panel that I had been on as a graduate student, and I reached out to him, and he was interested. And he even, again, in terms of that connection, he suggested one of our other authors, but he goes, "Oh, I know someone who's working on Ethiopia. They'd be perfect for this." And so it was sort of a twofer, if you will, from reaching out to him. So often it's those connections, those that helped us build who we wanted to, who ultimately was free, wanted to work on it, was intrigued by the idea, and that's how we were able to put that together.
Yeah, academia is really it feels like it's a vast kind of enterprise, but in reality, it's actually fairly close knit. And so generally, one of the challenges, if you want to be successful in academia, one of the challenges is that, yeah, you need to start talking to people and you start to get to know people. You may not be best friends, but good enough to have a conversation with, and that way people remember other people's names. They might remember your face, your name, and then later that could be someone you can reach out to get some help with something like a project like this, or perhaps help with some sort of job related
Mhm.
quest, or who knows what it might be. But getting to know the people in the profession is one of the big kind of challenges, but it can pay off
One
very
of the
well.
struggles for a discipline often filled with introverts that we actually have to have an extroverted side.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
right. I mean, this type of solitary research where you're sitting in a foreign archive somewhere for weeks on end, it demands a certain personality type that isn't always conducive to networking and all of that. And so maybe that's where the booze comes in, or who knows. But you got to get to know
liquid
people.
courage.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Okay, so we're meeting the authors through networking, and
Mhm.
so did you kind of leave it up to them to kind of just decide on the topics that they're going to look at, or it
No,
sounded
we
like you
reached
had
out.
kind of an idea, but did you
Yeah, we
match
had a
them
number of
up, or
conflicts we had in our mind. We had I mean, again, looking through that whole period, what are the number of conflicts we want? What do we? And we look to try and find a global balance. We at one point, for example, and again, this is that process that we reached out to authors. Some ultimately flaked on us, and it happens. It's people get busy. Um, One scholar, his family was, you know, uh, background is Armenian and dealing with problems in Turkey, and we're like, take your time, or you can, like there's both the minor issues and the big ones that can come up.
right?
But So, for example, at one point I was reaching out to another colleague saying, hey, would you want to do something on, the issues in Ireland? He's like, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And even when Ian and I talked about it later, we went, that's moving away from the globalized focus that we want. So even though it's a conflict during that period, we'll step back. But so when we approached each of them, we said, do you want to do something for this period and all the rest? And we knew their specialty areas, we knew what they were looking at, and they all sort of came in going, yeah, okay, I understand the conflict you're looking at. I think the only one we went more broad with was um, Dr. Stapleton, where we were saying, hey, here's a you are so knowledgeable of Africa during the colonial period. We we can leave it to you in terms of what specific conflicts you think you want to work with, but most of the rest we were looking at broader or more specific topics that they were coming and going, yeah, all right, I'm writing on this, I'm writing on this, and writing on that. So it was both this melding of individuals we knew or knew of, and all right, we're looking at this conflict. We think you could do that, or what are your thoughts? And going from there.
Right. And so looking at just the table of contents here, I mean, we've got, you've mentioned a lot of these already, but we've got the Arabian Peninsula, we've got China, we've got Japan, we've got Latin America, Spanish Civil War, Polish Soviet Civil War. So you've got all these conflicts happening around the world, and these are in a way, this is kind of a bunch of case studies of all these conflicts
Mhm.
happening around the world during the specific time period in here. And so, what did you kind of coming out of this?
Mhm.
What kind of conclusions can we draw about that? What are the kind of the trends here, or the commonalities? What can we say about the sure,
Yeah.
on the one hand, sure, the interwar period is more violent than we might think, especially for
Mhm.
Americanists, or somebody focused on a specific country that maybe wasn't fighting very in that period. But it certainly was a very violent period. But what are the kind of the trends and conclusions that came out of all this work?
Yeah. A number of different. It's very interesting that one of the first ones is to turn to Churchill and de Gaulle. Um, Most of our authors. almost all said that, that really works for Europe, and the further out you go, the less utility and less usefulness it has. It's that might work for just the European combatants, uh, but past that, you're really stretching it. Um, I think that was the interesting thing of seeing how people, each of our authors, sort of saw where they thought that fit, or where they would challenge it. I, I thought it was funny how Dr. Stapleton went with, I think that has no bearing at all. And in fact, I would say that we're really looking at 100 years war going all the way back to the colonial period through. So we sort of took that and said, yeah, I'm going to chuck that. But I think that made for an more interesting chapter. Um, what we saw was that there were a number of connections in terms of certainly technology. The technology that was neophyte at the beginning of World War One and then continued through was carrying forward. You were getting, in the case of Somaliland, you had Winston Churchill using the RAF as an attempt to cheaply deal with problematic forces in Somaliland. How can we use technology to cheaply administer and deal with problematic areas in the world? That would have been unheard of in 1914, where the Sir Douglas Haig, the head of the BEF, was saying, oh, I'm sorry, in exercises right before the war, that the only thing that an airplane was useful for was reconnaissance, and even then, it could never replace the horse, the cavalry. So something like that would have been unheard of. So you saw technological movements and all the rest. You also saw elements where it seemed almost like where there were sort of almost waypoints, way stations of that European influence. There was a greater connection, but the further away you got, that wasn't the case. Another major thing was the growth of ideology in all of these conflicts, in any number of these conflicts, in terms of how you were getting a ratcheting up of um, whether it's indigenous resistance, you're getting more ideological struggles appearing. Certainly by the Spanish Civil War, you have that in spades. Um, but you're getting those developments as well. And so we're left trying to say, okay, there are these drawing connections, there are these elements that are playing out. I would say for your students, for our attendees, if you want to know, get the book, though hopefully the Shapiro Library is. But I had the chance to the good chance to write the conclusion, and there was something I ran with that I thought helped make sense of this, because at the end, you're looking at it and say, okay, we have all these case studies. What does that tell us? The historian John Lewis Gaddis wrote a book called The Landscape of History. I highly recommend it for anyone who wants a interesting read into the discipline of history and how historians think. And in it, he posits that historians are artists. We can identify the scene, draw out what we want to highlight, bring to the forefront, in a painting, the mountains that we really want the eye to focus on, all the rest of that. And his argument was we were like artists in that we can pick and choose what we want to draw out. Now, we're not completely like artists. I can't say the Battle of Kursk took place between two sides riding unicorns. And I could write a book about that. It would be in a different section.
You wouldn't be invited back to the conference if you did that, though.
Too. But there's limits to it. But his point is that there is choices, there are decisions that you make as a historian as to what sources you're using, what archives you're going to, what elements of the historical narrative you want to bring out, what people you want to highlight. And so, okay, we're artists. So we just wrote this a series of paintings on the wall to wander through and look at. But I drew also from that book another metaphor that he used that I thought was helpful. Um, John Lewis Gaddis talks about fractals. I don't know if you've seen them before. They're sort of crazy, somewhat beautiful, mathematically driven, um, computer generated images that you can see, these fractals that show all sorts of large shapes, swirls, all the rest of this. And the person who got involved in that, when Mandelbrot, was all about how can I find a geometry of the real world. Talks about roughness. Geometry is this land of perfect shapes and all the rest of this. Well, life isn't made of perfect shapes. What can we do with this? And so he tried looking at fractals as a way of underscoring, how does that tell us a more real geometry, if you will? And one of the concepts that he talked about was self-similarity across scale. He uses the example, I think, of a cauliflower. Hold the cauliflower in your head, it looks a certain way. You cut a piece off of cauliflower that's a little smaller, it looks exactly like the big one. Cut, 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 even down to the smallest strand, it looks like a cauliflower head. Well, in much the same way, historians as artists taking our individual things, we create this picture of cacophony of this jagged lines and all the rest of this. And what you can take from that is actually a self-similarity across scale that, if we were looking at the French Revolution, the chaos of the French Revolution, this historian did a picture of Danton or Robespierre. This one did a work on the economic crises that led to the collapse of the French monarchy. This one did a social history of the sans-culottes, etc., etc. Well, we could look at that and say, well, that's just a cacophony. What does that mean? But as you focused in on it, that self-similarity across scale, you'd see how do all of these elements show some similarity. And so I posited in the conclusion, this is the way to see all of these different vignettes, these case studies. You see technology, you see the developments of strategy, you see the beginnings of the very, if you will, the laying of the groundwork of some of the very things that will lead to the larger conflicts in the Second World War, and be some of the elements not only of how they fight, but in some cases, what are the ways they think about fighting. Good example I'd use is my chapter was on Somaliland. So looking at that first example of using air power as this powerful weapon. And then the RAF got involved in dealing with all sorts of issues in Iraq. Well, in that process, a number of them are like, wow, the best way to deal with all these problematic people groups and those who are fighting is using this air power as a tool of hindering their morale, functionally using it as a weapon of terror. And while the World War I era planes that they're using in the desert don't very much seem like the 100 bomber raids over Schweinfurt or Berlin, the roots of it are in something like that are carrying it forward, that the lessons and the things that they're gaining from that are transferred into the later conflicts. And so, anyway, it was a fascinating process to be involved in. It was an enjoyable one, and very honored this spring. It won a Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History. So, yeah, I didn't think I'd be writing an edited work. I would never expected I'd have gotten a book out that won an award. So very enjoyable process.
Oh, congratulations. That's really cool. Yeah, and going down the fractals route and all that, that's a really kind of interesting way to kind of think about the mosaic of all of this. And what you can get out of it, what it leads to. Because looking at the list from the table of contents, it feels like you've got things just kind of scattered all over the place, and so you kind of wonder what's going on here, and you start to wonder about is this like colonization? Colonies going to war against each other? Is it like proxy wars? Is it But no, there's actually, homegrown, and there's
Mm.
lots of conflicts of specific to each conflict that may or may not influence other conflicts, and so it's an interesting topic, and it's very cool that you were able to get so many little case studies together to kind of try to make sense of all of this before you or somebody else publishes the masterwork that brings all of this together at some point in the future, the
Well, yeah,
masterpiece.
yeah. I think because I got that, I was asked by someone to review a book about the uh, uh, a book entitled Interwar Period. It has 50 contributors. I don't know
Yeah.
what. Just looks like a dictionary. I'm going, oh gosh, that's gonna be fun to read this month. But so good times and bad. But
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to reading it.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I'll,
Oh,
I'll be interested what if they decided to try and have a conclusion after that many entries.
yeah, that would be yeah, yeah. I was running a conference a couple years ago and we had 40 some presenters there. And yeah, my job was at the end was to try to offer some kind of concluding remarks at the conference to try to make sense of it all. And it was that was rough.
I
Just trying to
I
bring
I
it all together.
I liked Christopher Clark, who's an incredible historian. Wrote what I think is the best book on the origins of the First World War, Sleepwalkers. Wrote a recent one on the revolutions of 1848 and 1849, which is also a period of absolute chaos and everything else. But at one point he's writing, I hope I get the quote right, and he talks about, uh, talking shifting into all of the varied revolutions that are breaking out across Europe, and he says, and he wrote something like, and now the historian throws up his hands and uh, meanwhile becomes the adverb of last resort. Meanwhile this, meanwhile that. I can't tell you a logic. Just meanwhile something else happened.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, why don't you take a few minutes here and tell us about cartography in Africa? I mean,
Mm.
you mentioned that an advisor said, "Hey, have you ever looked at maps?" And of course, I like maps. Who doesn't like maps? So, so how do you take an interest in maps and start applying it to how do you get a work of history out of a discussion of maps?
Okay. Let's see. So the period of colonization with Africa is a massive one of exploration. And so cartography is intimately involved in that process. But as I started to delve into the literature of critical cartography, I was also making a point of saying that the sort of belief was, we are scientists going out into the hinterland, the wilderness, and cataloging what is true and all the rest of this. The issue is that even when you hit a period of, call it scientific cartography, more is going on there than we believe. We can look at early modern maps and say, yeah, they're, okay, they drew an elephant there, or a demon in the water. That's all made up. But you have, there's a great article I read in graduate school. It's called talking about the mountains of Kong. I'm sure you've all heard of them. It's a massive series of mountains in West Africa. You can all scurry to Google Maps and discover no, there are no such things. But for about a century, all these cartographers kept putting in the mountains of Kong, because some explorers said there were mountains there, and so they just kept regurgitating. Well, that map put it, so I have to put it down, and all the rest of the stuff. And so I started going, okay, there's some things going on here, and then with the funding of the support of the Ohio State University, I was able to go for my master's to look at the map archives at the University of Chicago. Eventually, I was able to go to go abroad to do more research. But you know, looking at this, I started to recognize, or I posited, that maps are constructed artifacts, and they're constructed for a future use. And so, what I wanted to trace was how were maps involved in this process of colonialization. And I came up with a sequence of, as I termed it, gazes. Gazes that, what was the gaze of the person looking upon the African landscape? Well, first you had the gaze of the discoverer looking to discover the land. Then you had the gaze of the despot looking to possess the land. And ultimately the gaze of the developer seeking to do something with that land that, oh yeah, that's now ours. And what you could see is actually the map was integral in that process. So, uh, for example, you would see explorer maps. And what would they do? They would highlight in, say, the color red, drawing your eye to that, what? Their route of exploration through along the Sabeki River into modern day Kenya, all the rest. Okay, what's important? Well, they are. The explorer is what they're discovering, what they're noting, what they're finding important. What are they noting? Where is water resources? Where are areas we might be interested in looking at more, et cetera, et cetera. What isn't important? The people of Africa themselves. They don't matter apart from, are there problematic tribes there that we're dealing with? The bloodthirsty Maasai was a big thing for years in that region of Eastern Africa. And after they explored, what happened? Well, prior to that point, Africa was this blank slate. What's there? Well, once you start etching what's there on it for the colonial enthusiasts, well, now that's a thing. It's no longer this blank space where we imagine anything's there. Now it's a real thing with real boundaries, and we now have a sense of what's there. Uh-oh, now I might lose it. And so what happens then? You start getting a new series of maps with that new purpose of ascribing ownership. It will have the boundaries. It will showcase, who owns what, and it can have competing claims there. Um, I'm hoping maybe it won't work. If I ever get the chance to make a pitch for cover art, there's a great one I found in Archives in Q of Mount Kilimanjaro and 3 lines where they were just saying, the Germans want this, the British wants this. This is where we're going to end up. And that shows a shift because while you were a discoverer, what mattered was that mountain. What mattered was that river. What mattered was that land. Oh, no, no, no. We know the land now. What really matters is us marking our ownership over it. We can take, you could look at maps of this exploration that were at a very small scale showing how important it was. Now it just almost recedes into the background because what really matters is I colored it the British blue or red. And then what happened next? Well, all of a sudden the land, which was so critical to either discover it or claim it, now kind of doesn't even matter at all. When the ownership and all of that is now assumed in the next stage of maps of looking at development. So you have maps in which the British are talking about schemes for a railway or all the rest, and ownership isn't even bothered with. It's just sort of this is British East Africa, or this is German East Africa. Like before we would have put where the boundaries were, it's just blank below there because this is ours. We don't care about that because we're busy working on developing this region. And so sort of the point being that the maps were a part of this process of conceptual or of continual conceptual re-understanding of Africa, reconceptualizing it for a new purpose and how it will be utilized for what we want to do now. Now, I'm a military historian. That sounds very not that. I very much saw it as sort of maps as this tool of almost intellectual conquest. It's a tool which is used to conceptualize the ground, all the rest of this, and then will play roles in how are you dealing with military affairs? How are you dealing with other issues? Also, I think that conception could lead to issues of later violence because there is sort of a colonial attitude of this is our land. When a tribe rebels, in some regards, they aren't just rebelling against the colonial control. They're rebelling against the map itself. They're objecting to reality. How could they? How crazy? You know. But even the development, there's a change there. Yeah, in the case of Kenya, the tribes which never mattered at all, ever. Here they are. We'll just write their name. We don't care. Well, they eventually get inscribed when they start putting them on reservations. And, oh yeah, this is where you're going to be, and you can't leave there. And all the rest. So, uh, how did the map change over time, and how was it taken through this process of colonization from the very exploration to um, trying to make money off this land that, of course, is now ours? So that's sort of the broad, the quickest way I can get through all that.
That's that's actually really interesting because I've been dabbling in some local history here
Hmm.
in the suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, and at one point I stumbled on a bunch of maps of
Hmm.
the town. Westerville is actually a fairly small area. It's only 40,000 residents now. So back in the day, this was a pretty small chunk of land. But it's interesting, and I hadn't really put it into the I guess the kind of the order or the timeline that you're talking about here, but it makes total sense because when you look at the oldest maps, yeah, it's got the physical features. It's like, yeah, there's a river over here, there's trees over here. And then a few years later, the next map, yeah, all of the physical features are gone. It's just, and then they just have boundaries around all the various plots of land and who owns
Hmm.
the plots of land. And you always look at that one and you get very frustrated because, like, I can't tell where this thing is because there's no physical features here anymore. Where is the
Hmm.
frickin' river that was here before? So I can put these two together. But as you say, the point it wasn't really necessarily to figure out, I mean, where all the rivers and stuff are. The purpose now is to tell
Hmm.
us who owns what chunk of land
Yep.
so that everybody knows that that's what the chunk of land. And then the next generation of maps will come out and they'll start actually putting down roads and all of that and at that point it starts to look a little bit more like modern
Hmm.
the modern town or whatever, but there's still a lot of unsettled the main drags might be there but none of the side streets and all that stuff,
Hmm.
and so it's interesting to think about the evolution of the map from one year to, and because in the past when I've looked at some of the middle stages, it's like these are just utterly useless to me because I don't care that Joe Smith owned that squiggle of land over there. But if you're able to, if and it is super challenging because you can't just like lay it over the other map because you don't know where the
Hmm.
river is. And so anyway, it's interesting to
Yeah.
see you kind of lay it out as kind of an evolution of priorities and an
Hmm.
evolution of um, what was important to the people that were making the maps.
Hmm.
And yeah, in the earliest of maps, there might be some mention of some local Native American group, but then yeah, of course, they're gone by the time you
Hmm.
get to the second, third, and further
Yeah.
generations of maps. Because yeah, the goal is to, if those people aren't already disappeared, we're going
Hmm.
to make them disappear
Yeah. Yeah.
because they're in the way. And
Hmm.
so Native American here versus, African
African. Yeah.
there, the whole purpose is to just make them vanish so that they're
Hmm.
just, we don't necessarily want to kill them all necessarily. We just want them to
Just
go
a little
away.
bit.
And so just go away and let us use the land better
Ex-
than you were using it before.
Except the reality. Yeah. The shift.
Yeah.
But uh, I just saw the time. I do want to make sure I don't just keep talking. If there's any questions or anything I could answer if anyone
That's a good
was.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, Rob and I go way back, so we could probably keep rambling all night. So, if anybody in the audience, this is a good time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to start typing into the chat box on the right side of the screen, or we can pause for a moment. If anybody would like to turn on their microphones and come on and ask a question, that's fine too. So let's just take a pause for a sec and see if anybody has any questions.
It's not necessarily a question,
Mhm.
but a comment for folks who might be in the Boston area and like maps.
Mm.
The Leventhal Map and Education Center, that's part of the Boston Public Library, has a really great feature called Atlas Scope, all one word, AL or ATLASCOPE. And it overlays all of the historical maps of the Boston area and with present day maps. And you can pick and choose where you want to look and what time periods. And it's fascinating.
Mm.
That's very cool. I actually used Boston back in my old days when I would be lecturing face-to-face classes. I used Boston as a example of of urbanization in the United States in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, because you could easily see by looking at different maps like that. I may have been pulling images from that resource from that repository. I don't know, but you could show how back in the day Boston was designed for walking, and you could basically walk to anywhere within Boston within I think it was like an hour. Yeah, you could but later when you get through kind of as urbanization arises in the especially in New England, that of course dissolves quickly because the city expands rapidly. They no longer really care about walking isn't really the way people get around anymore. So now they find new methods, new forms of transportation, and suddenly the city is much less compact than it used to be. And so they start filling in parts of the harbor and all of that. So um, there's a nice trip down memory lane for me. It was was talking about those maps with students, and that was always kind of interesting because students kind of liked the putting the maps side by side, showing about this is how cities evolve and in response to industrialization and new transportation systems and all of that. But that's really cool, and that Boston is actually a really good case study for that kind of thing.
Mm. Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is you're highlighting um, historians aren't Luddites, no matter what people might think. Um, One of the forefronts of a lot of work of historians is digital tools and harnessing them to do things that you couldn't see prior to that. And one of the ways you can see that is, um, there's the Africa Maps project. I forget who's doing it. It's not Stanford. They did something on Rome, but I forget who's doing it now. But you could put in, you had the Google map of Africa, and then you could overlay on it the ancient, or ancient, the old explorer map and compare, flip between it to go, what were they thinking was depicted there versus what is really there? Or you could look at some of these explorer maps and then, they would have databases on there in terms of conflicts and, different. So that's one of the amazing things to see how historians can just re-examine. I should go back to Gaddis. Uh, he says about historians as artists, we represent the past. We represent it, and technology is giving us whole new ways to represent the past and think about spatiality, distance. I mean, things that just being in an archive we couldn't fully grasp, and so technology gives you that opportunity.
Yeah, and I went through a big environmental history phase when I was working on my dissertation, and so yeah, the it's hard. We'd often don't really give enough credence to like distance as a historical factor, and because we tend to jump from event to event and all of that without really thinking about how do how do people move and what does how does that movement influence history, and how does the distance that you have to travel influence history, and maps are a pretty cool way to demonstrate that.
Yeah,
And yeah, there's been some amazing like geographical information system innovations that historians have used.
yeah. There was the one who won the Smithsonian prize from the Smithsonian, getting all our mapping students to go through Gettysburg and functionally make an argument that the reason that Lee and Longstreet had such issues on day two was they saw different battlefields. Like in terms of once they went through the maps and pictures of the period, tracing that out, and then making all the measurements, they the historian created two different maps where you go, yeah, if you're from Lee's vantage point, he says, yeah, it's just easy. He's right there. Longstreet is seeing an entirely different battlefield, even though they're not that far away from each other, but their perspective is shaped by by the land and all the rest. And thus, okay, that maybe explains the difficulties of command. For years, it was Longstreet's this, horrible general who deep down wasn't a courageous person like Lee. That's why, the South lost, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, no, he's being given orders for a battlefield that doesn't exist. And he gets the orders from Lee saying, advance on this, and he's staring through them. I guess I have to go around because I don't know what you're talking about. And it's because they were seeing different battlefields that until this geographic professor really got into the weeds of how can I understand this. Historians didn't see that. And then Stanford, their Orbis project, you can go online now. You can pick sort of any number of locations in the Roman Empire, select your method of travel, and then select where you want to go, and it'll pop up and tell you how long it would take and all the rest of this. You might look at that and say, well, that's kind of a very bad version of the Oregon Trail. But actually, historians are using that to go, okay, let's really think about some of the distance. Some of that actually has become a major resource for researchers to go, how does this help us better understand the distance involved in the Roman Empire and how that shapes events, decisions, all the like. So,
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, it's good stuff. So yeah, we are we're getting pretty far on time, but I do want to make sure that anybody that does have any remaining questions has a chance to jump in and ask. So I will pause for another minute here to see if anybody else has any questions.
All right. Well, since I need to riff a bit, let's see. So, 30 Years' War, massive change, all the rest of that. A good way of understanding the change in the 30 Years' War. When French Protestants French Huguenots would initially march off to battle. They would march off singing the Psalms. Near the end of the war, there's a point at which the French army is involved in fighting, and French cleric is giving a very ponderous and very clearly uninteresting theological speech to the troops assembled. The officer gets up, sort of pushes him aside and says, what Monsieur the Abbé wishes you to know is God hates cowards. Long live the king. Two vignettes that show you the massive change that occurred during the 30 Years' War, from confessional war to long live the king. That's all that matters.
The king doesn't matter, or God doesn't matter. It's all the king now.
Yep.
Very cool. All right. Well, on that note, I think we can probably wrap things up here. So thank you, Dr. Clemm, for joining me tonight. Thanks for the folks that came along. Thanks for the folks that came along for the ride. Just a reminder, our next event in this series is going to be on Wednesday, May 13th, 2026, when Dr. Matt Chandler is going to be talking about the use of generative AI in history research and proper uses of AI. How can we use AI? What are the types of research that can be done with AI? It's very good at finding commonalities and finding trends and all of that. So we'll hear from Dr. Chandler about that. He spoke to us last year, and this is going to be a continuation of that discussion. So hopefully people can make it to that. In the meantime, hopefully you all take care of yourselves. Thank you again, Dr. Clemm, and we will talk to everybody again soon. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please write to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For Rob Clemm, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.